class. It's Dr. Miller. Welcome to our Introduction to Logic class. I love this class, and I hope you will as well. Logic looks like a big, intimidating subject that comes from philosophy, or you might assume it's just kind of a simple common sense process of being able to reason. It's actually a fascinating mathematical way to analyze the kinds of arguments that we use on a day-to-day basis and look at their structure to see whether or not their structure holds together well. And so I love logic for what it does. Compared to most of the world of philosophy, logic actually establishes things and builds upon them, whereas philosophers otherwise seem to go around and around in circles and then just change the topic. Anyway, so I love logic, and I hope you will as well. A little introduction to myself before we get going here. I majored in philosophy at the University of California of Berkeley. So philosophy was the heart of what I wanted to study from the very beginning. I then got a master's in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. I also have a master's of divinity from Princeton Seminary because I knew I wanted to be a pastor, and seminary is pastor school. And then I got a doctorate from Fuller Seminary when I was well along in my pastoral career. So way too much education, and just kind of a nerdy way to live your life. But I really like philosophy. I've read a lot of philosophy. I really like logic, and I really like the way it works. So that's a brief introduction of why I am the one sitting here talking to you about logic. Married and have two kids. My daughter is 17 and my son is 14 now. I don't know how that happened. But loving that stage of life. And I'm in my day job, I'm the pastor of Real Life Church of Los Angeles, which is this great little church I started 5 years ago. We've expanded and grown. We started in a park. We actually met in a park to begin with, and way too many people showed up at the park, and there wasn't even a bathroom, and we said we can't do this again. So we moved into a rental facility the next week, and the congregation got bigger, and then finally we were in a middle school gymnasium for 3 years until we found a church property to rent. And we began doing that, and then a pandemic hit. And in the midst of the pandemic, another church called us and gave us the keys to their building. And so we inherited a building that came along with a preschool. So we now own and run a preschool as well as owning that building. And we still rent our original building, and we're going to meet in all those spaces at the same time. And who knows what comes next, because we're just making this up as we go. But it's been a fun growing experience. Real Life is a church that leads people to Jesus. And it doesn't matter what generation you are. It doesn't matter what life you've lived. It's a community of grace with a God-sized vision. And it's a church that I am in love with. And if you have the opportunity to come check it out, I think you'll love it too. There you go. That's that for now. Let's see. Some details for the course. We're going to be using Craig Delancey's concise introduction to logic. I can get you a copy of that if you don't already have one or can't find one. It's a great little book to use to dive into the subject of logic. We're also going to be using a book that I wrote called Hardwired, and you need to get a copy of that because we're going to use that as a living example of how logical argumentation works and what it does. There you go. Those are the texts for the course. If you need to get in contact with me, you can certainly use my email address, drjameswmiller@gmail.com. I'll place that on the screen. I also use Kakao and WeChat. So if any of those are your favorite, you can use those. If you're a student at the university taking this course with me, there will be little notes that you take each week on the courses. So I will give a lecture, you take notes, you answer some questions on it. Some of them are just notes on the lecture. Some of them are questions about what you're supposed to have learned from the lecture. Those are due the following week. So if you keep up to speed, do that every week and return those to me. That's how we'll do our online course. And then at the end of the quarter, there's a final exam. It won't be too hard, but it'll test to make sure you understand what we've done through the course. If at any point you get stuck, because logic for some people is confusing. It's a different kind of way of looking at things than they've ever done before. And you weren't expecting a math class, but it's going to feel like a math class in just a couple of weeks. And if you see yourself doing something that feels like a math problem and you don't understand why, don't hesitate to let me know. I'm glad to help you do this. I've walked lots of students through this process, and I'm glad to help you do it too. So don't hesitate to reach out. I think that is enough in the way of introductions. So let's dive in and get into the course. So let's talk about why to study logic first and foremost. Logic helps you to analyze the way you're arguing to see whether or not your arguments hold together in a thoughtful, cohesive way. We're going to figure out whether or not arguments are valid by looking at the logic behind them. Now, you have to bear in mind that when it comes to argumentation, logic is not the primary winner of the day. By and large, when people win arguments, they win arguments by crying, throwing a tantrum, manipulating, or forcing someone to do what they want. Logic is just a way to appeal to what we would hope would be our higher nature. If you go back into the ancient Greek world and you look at the teachings of the philosopher Plato, Plato said that the human persona, the human soul, is divided into three categories. There's the rational, which does the thinking. There's the passionate or the emotional, which is often motivated by things like desire to be noble or desire to be courageous, by the virtues. And then there are the appetites, which Plato would say are the most base part of human life. They're the sex drive and the drive for hunger, thirst. Those are just animalistic desires. So Plato would say there were three categories or three sections into which a person can be divided. And they really did believe they existed in the head, the heart, and the stomach. The image that Plato and philosophers since then have used is kind of like this, though. Imagine a man riding an elephant. And the man has a saddle on the elephant. He has a bridle in the elephant's mouth. He's taught the elephant how to obey his guidance. It looks like the man is in control. Most philosophers today would say that's about how well reason has control over the emotions. The emotions are like a great big elephant. And reason can generally sort of steer them, but when emotions take over, they are the strongest player in the room, and reason takes a back seat. Anybody who's gotten an argument with somebody who is upset knows exactly how true this is. But we hope that reason can be given allowances to take control over a situation and analyze it objectively so that we make good decisions. And so that's why it's important to study logic, because if we can get two people agree that they want to make wise decisions together, reason should be a significant part of the decision-making process. So that's why we study logic. Now, bear in mind, if we were going to study argumentation, we might go back and look at Aristotle's rhetoric and see that Aristotle said that logic was one of three major categories of oral presentation, and all three are of equal importance. Logos, which is from which we get the word logic, is reason, and all good speech, all good oration is reasonable. It convinces people with powerful arguments that what the speaker is saying is true and should be believed. But Aristotle would say pathos is equally important. Passion, the emotions, the appeal to the audience that makes them laugh and makes them cry and makes them passionate about what the speaker is passionate about. Pathos is equally important. And then ethos, or the character of the speaker. From ethos, we get the word ethical, right? If you see that the speaker is a good person with a reliable character and a thoughtful or gracious personality, you might think, I identify with that speaker, I like that speaker, I respect that speaker. And so ethos is a compelling part of public speech as well. We're going to steer away from the first two and just hone in on logos, on logic. And we're going to look at how logic works. We're going to look at fallacious arguments that people mistakenly make and what has gone wrong in their logic that causes them to do that. We're going to look at breaking logical arguments down into a symbolic language that can be used to analyze logical arguments. And we're going to look at the various components of that logical language, that alphabet of logic that allows us to analyze arguments. So we're going to do, that's a lot more than we can cover in this course, but we're going to dive into all of that and do a lot of that. I just want to say from the get-go, logic allows us to study from one aspect of the human will how arguments work in the hopes that if we can agree to use logic, it will guide us on wise paths, but it is not in any way the only way that we approach argumentation, nor is it necessarily the most powerful. It's just an important component in its own right. Now let me name 3 different kind of arguments so that we can begin to break down which ones we're going to focus on. There are 3 types of argumentation known as abduction, induction, and deduction. And I want to look at those 3 in order. The reason I want to start with abduction, although we're not going to deal with it at all in the course, is because a lot of times when we think about logic, our minds are drawn immediately to Sherlock Holmes, right? Logic is making conclusions from observations. And he would go around saying, it's elementary, Watson. It's elementary, Watson. It's logic, right? Or he'd say deduction. It's actually not deduction at all, what Sherlock Holmes was doing. Abduction is drawing the most logical conclusion from the available evidence. So you walk into a room, there's a person on the floor who's been stabbed with a knife, there's someone standing over them holding a knife, there's a pretty good conclusion that you come to, which is that that person murdered the person lying on the floor. However, that's abduction. That's just looking at the available evidence and taking your best guess. And abduction, while it is a kind of reasoning, is not the kind of reasoning we're going to focus on in the class. A second kind of reasoning, which we're also not going to spend a lot of time on in the class, is called induction. Now, induction is more important because induction is what science does. Induction is the process of coming to a conclusion based on multiple representations of the same experiment or point that take you to a similar conclusion. So in other words, induction would be if I said I threw a rock in the pool and it sank. And then I did it again and it sank again. And then I did it 50 times and all 50 rocks sank to the bottom of the pool. I could conclude all rocks sink to the bottom of the pool when you throw them in the pool. And that's an inductive argument. And it's not a bad conclusion. I'm probably right or pretty close to right by doing that. I can do more experiments and do it 100 times and just find out it's all the more likely. I can do it with different kinds of rocks and find out it's all the more likely. The problem is there's no amount of experiments that you can do in order to wholly or completely prove something by induction. I'll give you a weaker example of induction to show you why it doesn't work. Imagine I go and ask someone a question in English, and they answer back in English. And then I go ask another person a question in English, and they answer back in English. And then I go ask a third person a question in English, and they answer back in English. Let's say I do it 50 times, and all 50 people I talk to answer my English question in English. And then I draw the conclusion, anytime you ask a person a question in English, they're going to answer in English. Well, that's of course false. I can do that experiment here in Los Angeles and probably get 100% in terms of my results. But if I went to Beijing or Tokyo or Seoul and did the same experiment, I would get very different results. And so that's why induction is limited. And science is limited. Because science operates from a chosen hypothesis through a process of experimentation that can only be done to so much of an extent before the scientist draws a conclusion. And many scientific experiments are questioned because the scope of their exploration was too limited. They didn't interview enough people. They didn't do enough trials. It didn't go through enough tests. And when you come to things like medicine, they want medicine tested thousands of times before it's made available to the public because they want a broader and broader survey before they release medications for public consumption. That's what induction is. Induction is a process of drawing a conclusion through multiple experiments that point towards an observation about the experiments overall. However, that's not primarily what we're going to be looking at in this class either. What we're going to be looking at in this class is called deduction. And deduction is a process of argumentation by which if the premises of an argument are true and the argument is logical, then the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So let's break that down a little bit. Premises are the statements that lead into an argument. They are the building blocks of an argument. And the conclusion is what is drawn from the premises. So for instance, I can say, all men are mortal. That's a premise. A second premise could be Socrates is a man. Those two premises together lead to the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. That's the conclusion. And that's a good logical argument because the truth of the premises and the structure of the argument necessarily lead to the truth of the conclusion. But let's get some more precise vocabulary here as we talk about deductive argumentation. It's tempting to call an argument good or logical or convincing, but we want some more precise words to say exactly what we mean about arguments. The first word we want to add to our vocabulary is valid. And valid means the arguments lead to the conclusion because they hold together in a systematic way that makes the conclusion necessary. The example I just gave you with Socrates is a valid argument because if all men are mortal and if Socrates is a man, then necessarily Socrates is mortal, right? That's a valid argument because the premises lead to the conclusions. Now, you can have a valid argument in which the premises are false, but they still lead to a conclusion. So I could say, all men are purple, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is purple. Now that's still a valid argument, right? If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true also. It's valid. But the premises are not true because it's not true that all men are purple. It's not true that Socrates is purple, right? So for the argument to be valid, it does not require that the premises be true. It only requires that they hold together consistently in a way that necessarily leads to the conclusion. That's a valid argument. An argument in which the premises lead to the conclusion necessarily, whether or not the premises are true. But let's add another word now. Let's talk about what a sound argument is. Let's say the argument necessarily leads to the conclusion, the premises necessarily lead to the conclusion, but the premises are also true. And if the premises are true, and the argument is valid, it holds together, leads to the conclusion, then the argument is sound. So if an argument is sound, then it's also valid. But an argument can be valid without being sound, such as the purple men example. In a sound argument, the premises have to be true as well. So all students who do well on their homework will get an A in the class. You're going to do well on your homework, therefore you're going to do well in the class. Premises are true, I hope, right? I hope you're going to do well in the class, and they lead necessarily to the conclusion. When you get into speculating about the future, you compromise the soundness of an argument. We could talk about it in the past and make sure that it's sound, right? All students in my last class who studied hard did well in the class. Bob studied hard, therefore Bob did well in the class, right? That's a valid argument because the premises are true. That's a valid argument because the premises lead to the conclusion, and it's a sound argument because the premises are also true. So that's a sound argument and a valid argument, and those are the building blocks of deductive logic, deductive reasoning. So you need to have those words pretty firmly in your mind. It's good to know what abduction and induction are, but as I said, we're not going to focus on these a lot in the class. There, make sure you got those down, and that's a good introduction to some building blocks of our vocabulary. So in philosophy, we care a lot about the precise definitions of the words that we use because philosophy really gets into the weeds about what words mean, and a confusion and ambiguity over the use of a word can throw off an argument. And so I want to lay out 10 of the most common vocabulary words used in the approach to logic that we're going to need through all of the rest of this course. And you'll notice that I'll use these with fair consistency. First, logic. Number one, logic is a system of principles to govern the validity of argumentation. It's the It's the system by which we can determine whether or not arguments are valid. And there are going to be rules that valid arguments follow. And if an argument violates these rules, it is no longer a valid argument and no longer a logical argument. So that's what logic is. It's the system of principles that govern the validity of argumentation. Number 2, an argument. An argument is the assertion of a conclusion based on logically related premises. You might think an argument is just shouting at each other. Not in this class. An argument is putting premises together to lead to a conclusion, and then we evaluate whether or not they do so well. So that's an argument, the assertion of a conclusion based on logically related premises. Number 3, a premise is evidence used in an argument. And when an argument is laid out, premises are the lines that lead down to the conclusion. Usually there's a series of premises that lead to one conclusion. So number 4, a conclusion is the logical result of the relationship of the premises. It's the way the sentences relate to one another and what can be concluded from them, drawn out of them, that constitutes the conclusion. Number 5, a syllogism. A syllogism is a deductive argument in which a conclusion is drawn from two premises. So you'll hear me say things like, premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. That is a syllogism. It's two premises leading logically to a conclusion, and those together make up a syllogism. This structure goes back to Aristotle in the ancient Greek world, and you'll see how important syllogisms are to everything else we do. Number 6, deduction. Deduction is drawing a conclusion from premises through a system of logic. It's most of what this course is going to be about is deduction. Another kind of reasoning, number 7, is induction, and this is not one that we're going to spend a lot of time on. Induction is what scientists do. They study the facts of the material world and then draw a conclusion based on multiple observations and repeated tests. That's what induction is. They look at a body of evidence and through repeated testing draw out what they think is the best conclusion. That's induction. And number 8, abduction. Abduction is actually what Sherlock Holmes does. It's what police officers do. It's the inference to the most likely conclusion. Looking at what scant evidence you have and considering which evidence is stronger and which is weaker, what's your best guess as to what explains all the evidence? That's abduction. Number 9, valid. Valid is when the conclusion is drawn necessarily from the premises. An argument is valid. And sound is when an argument is both valid and all the premises are true. So if an argument is sound, it is also valid. But an argument can be valid without being sound if the premises are not true. And those are 10 critical vocabulary words that we're going to use throughout this course. Make sure you understand those well. If you don't have those down, send me a note and ask, or Google them, look it up. You want to make sure you understand those 10 words for the rest of this course. Let's talk about one of the major obstacles to logical argumentation, logical reasoning. That is called cognitive distortions. And a cognitive distortion is a predisposition of your mind to think things in the wrong way, to make assumptions that actually lead you in wrong directions. All of our brains do it. There are neuroscientists and evolutionary biologists who would argue that our brains might have evolved in wrong ways on purpose, because for whatever reason, perceiving the world wrongly might better lend itself to survival than perceiving the world exactly correctly. So for instance, if I see the world as being a little bit more dangerous than it really is, it will cause me to protect myself a little bit more than I need to, and the overall benefit of that will be that I don't get injured as much, or I'm less likely to be killed. And that is a survival technique which can be brought about through wrong perception of the world, a cognitive distortion. So I want to talk about some cognitive distortions that are very common and identifiable that sometimes mess with the way we try to reason. One of them is called the confirmation bias. And a confirmation bias means that you operate under the assumptions that the things you think are already true, and new knowledge needs to be assimilated into the structures of knowledge you already have. So for instance, if I perceive that religious people are particularly unwise, that they're superstitious and they jump to conclusions. That's my bias towards religious people. And then if I meet a religious person and they're quick to believe something I say, I can then think in my mind, aha, that's right. That's just confirming what I already knew. They believe things easily. And so they've just gone ahead and believed what I said because they believe things easily. Well, that might not be the case. The person I'm talking to might be very reasonable and might have already thought through the subject we're talking about. And they might not be gullible at all. But I have a bias about religious people, and so I find confirmation of my bias in new information. And confirmation bias is a cognitive distortion that all of us have, and it leads all of us astray at one time or another. That one is related to another cognitive distortion known as the framing illusion. And the framing illusion means whatever information we take in is framed or shaped by the information we've taken in just before that, or the mood we're in just before that, or the way we're seeing the world just before that. Information is framed by what comes just before it. I'll give you an example. There was an actual study done of college students, and they were asked two questions. They were asked, how happy are you? And how many dates have you been on recently? But there was a difference. There were the college groups were the college students were broken into two groups, and one group was asked the questions in the order that I named. How happy are you? And how many dates have you been on recently? And then the second group was asked the questions in the reverse order. How many dates have you been on recently? And how happy are you? Well, the two groups showed that the first group reported average levels of happiness. Generally, people were happy. But the second group reported higher levels of unhappiness because they were forced to concentrate first on how many dates they had been on recently. And for many of them who didn't feel like they had been dating enough or didn't feel particularly adequate as it came to romance and self-esteem, they reported lower levels of happiness because the answer to the second question was framed by the answer to the first question. And again, when we spell that out, we can see that as something that we could easily avoid. But in fact, all of us do this all the time. Our knowledge is framed by what we were thinking or feeling just before we consider it. Another cognitive distortion is negative filtering. We tend to be attracted to bad news, and we tend to go looking for it. And that's why the headlines of the news stations are almost all negative. It's because that's what we'll click on. And if we click on a news article, the news site gets advertising revenue from the ads that pop up on the page we clicked on. And so if we're more likely to click on bad news, the news agency makes more money from articles that report on bad news. So they're more likely to put bad news up in front of us, which makes us click on it more, which perpetuates a cycle of negativity. We all have sort of a bias towards the negative. It's very hard to incline yourself to focus just on positive things because in general, we tend to be drawn towards negative things. Again, evolutionary biologists would say that's a survival technique. If you're paying attention to things in your environment that are bad for you or that are dangerous or scary, you're more likely to survive. And so a negative bias could be an evolutionary survival mechanism because it is true for so many of us. That's one place that people think it comes from. Another cognitive distortion is known as the correlation and causation confusion. We confuse two things that are correlated with each other, they happen together, and assume that one caused the other, though that's not necessarily the case. So for instance, I could say during a rainstorm when there's thunder outside, the cat runs and hides under a chair. And then again, there's a rainstorm and it thunders outside and the cat runs and hides under a chair. And those two things happen together, so I assume the thunder is causing the cat to go and run and hide under a chair. Well, it might turn out that the cat is chasing a mouse, and the cat just happens to run after the mouse at the two times that I hear thunder outside. But because those things happen together, because they're correlated, I assume they're causal. I assume one causes the other. And that's actually wrong reasoning. That is fallacious reasoning. A fallacy is an error in reasoning, and fallacious reasoning is reasoning that commits a logical error. So a very common one is the mistake between correlation and causation. The fact that two things happen together does not mean that one necessarily caused the other. Proving cause is a harder case to make. Another kind of cognitive distortion or fallacy is a false dichotomy. And a false dichotomy comes when we assume that there can only be two answers to a question, and we make them polar opposites. And we act like there can't be a third choice or a middle way between the two. So for instance, imagine a religious person asks someone, do you believe in God? And that person responds, no, I believe in science, so I can't believe in God. Well, that's a false dichotomy. You can be a scientist and still believe in God. In fact, some very famous and noteworthy scientists alive today are religious people. It's not a dichotomy in which you have to choose between the two. You can actually embrace both. False dichotomy is when you assume that there are only two options with no third way, and that if one of the options is false, the other must be true. Another fallacy, and I'm switching between cognitive distortion and fallacy. A cognitive distortion is really a mental process that points us in the wrong direction, that inclines us to wrong reasoning. A fallacy is actually an error in reasoning, and actually an error in the reasoning process. Cognitive distortions tend to cause fallacies. Here's one that's actually a fallacy, and it's an identified fallacy that gets discussed in philosophy. It's called the genetic fallacy. And the genetic fallacy says that because something comes from a certain source, that source does not make the thing that comes from it either true or false, good or bad. So, for instance, let's say here's a place it came up a lot in recent years in debates over homosexuality. People would argue that because homosexuality is genetic, therefore it must be morally permissible. But that's a genetic fallacy. The fact that something occurs naturally does not make it morally permissible. In fact, morality is the exact opposite of that. Morality is the controlling of natural desires to produce ends that we believe are socially responsible. So morality necessarily entails curbing one's inclinations and desires, even though they be natural. The genetic fallacy says, well, it comes about through a natural cause, therefore it must be moral or permissible or good. That's fallacious. Things can come about from a good source and still be bad. For instance, let's say a very noted and celebrated mathematician does a very complicated math problem and produces an answer. And people will say that must be the answer because he's such a good mathematician. Well, that's actually false. A good mathematician can still produce errors, and a bad mathematician can still solve problems correctly sometimes. So whether or not a person is a good or bad mathematician does not actually determine whether or not the math problems that they do are right or wrong. Those have to be determined on their own weight through considerations of mathematics. There are lots and lots of fallacies that exist, and it's important to have sort of a sense for some of the most common ones, because you'll see them when you listen to politicians debate, you'll see them when you debate, and it's good to be aware of what they are. If you can name them, it helps you to sort of hone in on why the argument is going the way it is. Another common fallacy is an ad hominem fallacy. And this isn't an error in reasoning, this is sort of the abandonment of reasoning. An ad hominem fallacy means you're attacking the person that you're speaking to instead of arguing with them. So for instance, let's say a Catholic priest and a Protestant pastor are in a debate about whether or not Catholicism or Protestantism is better. And the Catholic priest says, well, I think there are a lot of errors in Protestant theology. And the Protestant theologian says, well, you guys kept abusing children, and so you guys aren't trustworthy. Well, that's not actually a logical argument at all. That's an ad hominem fallacy. It's an attack on the person, and perhaps even an incorrect attack on this poor innocent guy who just wants to have a conversation. Ad hominem fallacies come up a lot in political debate because a person will take a cheap shot at their opponent instead of talking about the substantive issues. Another common fallacy is the straw man argument. And the straw man argument is where you reproduce the weakest, most feeble version of your opponent and then knock that down. Arguing against a weak version of your opponent is not generally seen as credible argumentation. A good logician will try to create the best possible case they can for their opponent and then show why their opponent is wrong in the best case scenario. So for instance, a straw man argument would be to say, oh, religious people believe anything. I bet you believe in a flying spaghetti monster too. Well, that's not actually how theology works. People don't just pick some imagined deity to believe in. There's actually a complex system by which people come to adopt religious views, and it's not simply an arbitrary choice. That's a straw man argument. Another common fallacy is a slippery slope fallacy. Imagine this comes up a lot in public argumentation about drug use and the legalization of marijuana. The straw man argument would be to say, if we allow people to use marijuana legally, pretty soon they'll be using cocaine and heroin too. That's not necessarily the case. People might commonly drink alcohol without going to harder drugs. The fact that one uses one substance does not mean they feel set free to use all the other ones. I've heard this one used really stupidly in churches when an elderly person doesn't like the dress code and doesn't want people dressing casually to church because they remember growing up wearing neckties and dresses to church. And so when a church begins to allow people to wear jeans instead of dressing up, this person says, if you allow people to wear jeans, pretty soon they'll be coming to church in their bathing suits. Pretty soon they'll be coming to church in their underwear. Well, that's not true. That's a slippery slope. And slippery slope arguments are often the worst kind of argument because one thing does not necessarily lead to another. And the assumptions of where things are going to lead create all kinds of sort of ridiculous reasoning. You can actually see this in modern debates about, some of this comes up in environmental debates as people catastrophize and talk about the end of the world that's coming. That's a catastrophic argument. An argument things are going to just fall apart is a slippery slope argument that's carried out to the extreme. And slippery slope arguments are not good arguments. Another common argument is appeal to the general public, or it's sometimes called the bandwagon fallacy, and it's the argument that everybody's doing it, everybody thinks this, and so you should think it too. Well, everybody can be wrong, and everybody does not necessarily agree on some given topic. So arguments, everybody is saying this, and I'm just passing it along to you. That's usually fallacious reasoning based on what the actual speaker wants to be the case, and they're just trying to pull everyone else in on it. And finally, there's an appeal to authority, which is not, can create fallacious arguments. There are legitimate ways to appeal to authorities. If you appeal to a scientist in the field of science in which they are an expert and use their work to make a scientific argument, that actually can be a legitimate appeal to authority. But saying that 5 out of 10 scientists agree actually does not create a good argument, because there are all kinds of different scientists with different fields of expertise, and they don't all agree on the same stuff. And just appealing to a generic authority out there usually creates a weak argument that the speaker is trying to hide underneath the fallacy. So all that to say, there are a number of other fallacies as well. There are a number of other cognitive distortions as well. Just be aware of the fact that our brains can go astray, and that there are ways that we misuse reasoning, because what's driving our thinking is the elephant that the man is riding on. Our feelings and passions drive what we choose to believe in far more than reasoning itself. Reasoning is a complicated process. It takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes a calm demeanor. And it's far more easy to bring reason in simply to defend things that we're already passionate about rather than letting reason lead the way. Now let's begin to look at some of the building blocks of the logical problems we're going to be doing together. We're going to go through a process that's called formalization. And this is the part where people start to get a little bit confused because it's an unusual way to think of things, but believe it or not, at the end of the day, it's actually very logical. We're going to start by turning sentences into letters that represent them. We're going to use sentences that become atoms. They're building blocks of a larger structure. And we're going to do what's called atomizing sentences. So let's say we're going to analyze the argument. If it's raining, then I will carry an umbrella. That's proposition 1. If it's raining, then I'll carry an umbrella. Proposition 2, it's raining. Conclusion, I'll carry an umbrella. Now, there's a reason why philosophers want to reduce this kind of argumentation to a simple representative structure, so as to remove us from the argument itself. It actually works in a practical way. If we come to a debate about a very heated subject, like let's say we're going to debate about abortion, there's a lot of very strong opinions. People immediately start to react emotionally to an issue like that. But if you can reduce the argument to atomic letters that represent English sentences and remove the English sentences from the page, then we can begin to talk about whether or not an argument is logical without arousing any of the emotion that comes with this specific topic of the argument. I'll show you how this works. Let's go back to the umbrella and the raining example. If it's raining outside, I'm going to carry an umbrella. We're going to start by reducing some of these sentences or parts of sentences to letters. So we're going to take the sentence, if it's raining outside, or the half sentence, if it's raining outside, and we're going to reduce that to the letter R. And then we're going to take this half sentence, then I will carry an umbrella, and we're going to reduce that to the letter U. And so instead of saying, if it's raining outside, then I will carry an umbrella, we're simply going to say, proposition 1, if R, then U. Proposition number 2, remember, was it's raining outside. Well, we already have a letter that represents that, so proposition 2 is simply R. And the conclusion was, then I will carry an umbrella, and we've already got a letter for that. That letter is U. And so the way this argument reads, when it's formalized, when it's translated from English phrasing into letters that represent the atomic units of the argument, the way it actually reads is, if R, then U. Second proposition, R, conclusion, U. And then we actually get to look at the skeleton of the argument. We actually get to look at the structure of the argument, removed from some of the ambiguities of language itself. And now we're reducing ourselves down to being a bit like a calculator, where we can just analyze components that are input in a machine. And if the components that are input in the machine follow the rules of the machine, then the machine will produce for us the conclusions that can be drawn from the premises. Now, you'll see how that gets more interesting when we talk about heated issues. So if we say, if abortion is legal, then women will commit murder. Proposition 2, abortion is legal. Conclusion, women will commit murder. Well, now there's all kinds of emotional baggage tied to that argument, and whether or not the first premise has any truth at all or should be considered true or needs to be proven true is sort of the weight of the argument. And you can imagine if you started going down an argument like that and saying, now, is the logic of the argument valid? Well, actually, the logic is valid. But that's not what's going to prompt people to react to that. What's going to prompt people to react to that is the rhetoric with which the argument is presented. If we can reduce it, though, to formalized structured language instead of English, then we say things like, if A, then M, A, therefore M. Is that structure valid? Yes, it is. And we can discuss whether or not whether or not the propositions that the debater was using were appropriate, but we can say the logic of the argument is valid. The logic holds together because the structure is correct. It follows the rules of propositional logic. We're gonna begin as we get into propositional logic by analyzing a few different kinds of propositional statements, and we're going to use something called truth tables to decide whether or not propositional sentences spelled out in formalized logic are true. Now I want to talk about how to take the atoms that make up symbolic logic and form them into complex sentences, or compound sentences, they're called. So for instance, R represents the sentence, "It's raining outside." And that's an atomic sentence, a basic building block of the arguments that I'm going to make. So the letter R is an atom. But if I want to form the sentence, "If it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella," I formalize that with the symbols R, then U. If it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. And that's a compound sentence because I've taken atoms and combined them with a little symbol in between that's called an operator. And there are several operators in symbolic logic. Operators work a lot like the functions on a calculator that allow us to do things with numbers. On a calculator, I input numbers, and then I put a symbol in between them that makes the numbers do things. I put a plus sign that adds them together, or a minus sign that subtracts them, or an X that multiplies them. These are the truth functions of symbolic logic. These operators decide what we can do with the atoms. There's a limited number of them, but there are a few, and we're going to go through a few of them together. The first one to know is the negation. So if the letter R represents the sentence, "It's raining outside," and I want to represent the sentence, "It's not raining outside," symbolically, what I do is I take the letter R and I put a little negation sign in front of it, which for this class, we're going to use the tilde, the little swervy minus sign that is often above the 1 on your keyboard. The negation means not. So not R means it's not raining outside. The second operator to know is the conjunction. In our class, we're going to represent this with a dot. A conjunction means and. And if I put R dot U, what I'm saying is it's raining outside and I'm carrying an umbrella. That's what R and U means. And in this class, when we use the conjunction, what we mean is either one of the elements, both elements of the conjunction need to be true for the conjunction to be true. So for instance, if it's raining outside, but I'm not carrying an umbrella, then the conjunction, "It's raining outside and I'm carrying an umbrella," is false. It requires both of them to be true. For R and U to be true, both R has to be true and U has to be true. We'll get into more of this later as we go, and it'll make sense as we compound our knowledge. But just know for now, the second operator is a conjunction. It's represented by a dot, and it means and. And for the and sentence to be true, both of the atoms within the sentence have to be true. The next operator is called a disjunction. And a disjunction means or. We're going to represent it with a V. And in an or statement, what I would be saying is either it's raining outside or I'm carrying an umbrella. R, V, U. R or U. And for this sentence to be true, either one of the components can be true. So if it's raining outside, but I'm not carrying an umbrella, then R or U is true. It means either either it's raining outside, or I'm carrying an umbrella, or both. But if any combination of those is the case, then the sentence is true. If it's not raining outside, but I am carrying an umbrella, then R or U is true. The only way R or U is false is if R is false and U is false. It's not raining outside, and I'm not carrying an umbrella. So R or U, in that case, is false. That's the disjunction. We'll represent it with a V. The next one is called a conditional, and we'll represent this with an arrow sign. And this is the sentence I've been saying in this syllogism from the very beginning. If it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. And the if-then sentence with the arrow in between represents exactly that. If it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. Conditional sentences like that are true in all cases except when the first atom is false and the second atom is true. So if it's not raining outside, but I am carrying an umbrella, no, other way around. If it is raining outside, but I'm not carrying an umbrella, then the sentence is false. Because what the sentence promises is that if it is raining outside, then I will carry an umbrella. So in the case where it is raining outside, but I'm not carrying an umbrella, the sentence is false. But in all other cases, the sentence is true. If R then U is true. Finally, fifthly, we have what's called biconditionals. And a biconditional means if P, then Q, and if Q, then P. For instance, if I say R biconditional U, what I'm saying is if it's raining outside, then I'm carrying an umbrella. And if I'm carrying an umbrella, then it's raining outside. And that's a biconditional. And that'll be represented with 3 lines back and forth or an arrow pointing in both directions. That's what a biconditional is. Now, that for now might sound like a bunch of gibberish to you. You may have no idea what I just said. This is why it's helpful to follow along in the textbook and read about logical argumentation and how the symbolic logic works. We're going to begin building something called truth tables, and you're going to see what happens when we combine atoms to form compound sentences, and how we can begin to evaluate whether or not arguments are logically valid and sound, based on what we know how to do with these operators. Follow along in the textbook and stick with it. This will all make sense as we go. Now there's one more simple element to symbolic logic, to logical sentences that you need to know in order to begin to work on some of the problems that we're going to do. They're not operators per se, but they're part of the symbolic logic equations. They're necessary. And these are parentheses and brackets. Parentheses and brackets just tell the person who's computing the equations which elements to do first. And so I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm trying to form the sentence, if I'm wearing a hat or if I'm carrying an umbrella, then it's raining outside. And it matters that if I'm wearing a hat or I'm carrying an umbrella are two things that play a determination into whether or not it's raining outside. I have to put parentheses around the disjunction. Either I'm wearing a hat or I'm carrying an umbrella in parentheses. If either of those are true, then it's raining outside. If I put the parentheses around the second two atoms, I'm actually saying something completely different. I'm saying either I'm wearing a hat or if I'm carrying an umbrella, then it's raining outside. And that's a very different kind of sentence. So it matters where you put the parentheses in order to communicate to people what you're trying to say. There are some exceptions to this rule, and it's similar to mathematics. If I say 2 times 3 times 5, it doesn't matter what order I do those in. I can do 2 times 3 first, or I can do 3 times 5 first, or I can even do 2 times 5 first, and I'll get the same answer either way. It sort of works similarly in some cases with symbolic logic. You don't want to assume that it's exactly like math equations, but there are some cases where it's similar. And so, for instance, in the conjunction A and B and C, there's more flexibility that you can have with the parentheses than you can in other sentences. Brackets then allow us to elaborate on a longer string of atoms, a more complex sentence, by designating what comes first and what comes second. You do what's in the parentheses first, and you do what's in the brackets second. And really long sentences can get very complicated with multiple sets of parentheses and brackets. You just have to be very, very careful about where you place them. But again, if you know anything about mathematics, you have some sense of how this works already. It just works within the structure of symbolic logic. Now this is where logic gets fun. We're going to start solving some problems using symbolic logic. We're going to start taking some English sentences and translating them into the atomic language of symbolic logic. And I'll give you some examples because if you're in my university class, this is going to be on your homework, and I'll show you how it works. Imagine the sentence, Andre will not both be the starting pitcher and miss practice this afternoon. Andre will not both be the starting pitcher and miss practice this afternoon. How would you represent that in symbolic logic? Well, you hear there's an and in there, so there's probably a conjunction. But you also hear the word not, so there's probably a negation. And it's going to matter where you put the parentheses so that you don't negate the wrong thing. What we might do is represent Andre starting as the letter S and represent missing practice as the letter M. And we can then say S and M, right? If he starts and misses practice, right? That's not going to happen. So it can't be the case that both of those things are true. So what we can do is put S and M as a conjunction in parentheses and then put a negation in front of the parentheses. That's to say, again, it can't be the case both that Andre starts and he misses practice. Now notice if you put the negation in front of he doesn't start, you actually form a different kind of sentence. So you want to make sure you designate where these go in order to correctly translate the English sentences into symbolic logic. Let's do another one. Here we go. We will either go to the movies or dinner tonight, but not both. What would you do with that one? We will either go to the movies tonight or dinner, but not both. Let's make M going to the movies tonight and D going to dinner tonight. And what would you do with those sentences? You could say, it's actually a little more complex than you might think. You could say M or D, right? And then put that in parentheses. Either we will go to the movies or we will go to dinner. Now, how do you say, but not both? What you want to do is there's obviously a disjunction in there. So we're gonna not disjunction. There's a negation in there. We're gonna negate the both. So let's combine going to the movies and dinner, M and D in parentheses, and then put a negation in front of that. So it's not the case that they're both true. Either M or D, but not M and D. Now, how do we connect those two things? Well, that's actually a conjunction. So we put a dot in between those two things. So the concluding sentence is open parentheses, M or D, close parentheses, and not, open parentheses, M and D, close parentheses. See what we're doing there? Those are pretty basic examples of how to turn English sentences into symbolic logic. And if that doesn't make sense to you from listening to this, stop and get your textbook out, look at some examples of it, practice some examples of it. These are the basic building blocks of symbolic logic. If you don't get this first, you won't be able to do anything else in the course. So make sure you understand what we're doing here. We're taking English sentences or arguments and we're converting them into the language of symbolic logic. We're then deciding which operators are the proper ones to express what is being said in English without accidentally saying something we don't mean to say. All right, let's do some more. Let's say we're translating the sentence, neither stocks nor bonds provide an absolutely risk-free investment opportunity. Neither stocks nor bonds provide an absolutely risk-free investment opportunity. And we'll say S is stocks provide an absolutely free investment opportunity, risk-free investment opportunity. And B is bonds provide an absolutely risk-free investment opportunity. And it's neither one is the case. So how do you represent that? Well, you can say not S and not B. That's the most straightforward way to do it. Not S and not B. Neither one is the case. It's not the case that stocks do it. It's not the case that bonds do it. So both. Yeah, and let's flesh that out a little bit further. Let's say Dave invests in both stocks and bonds, although neither provide an absolutely risk-free investment opportunity. And we'll say D is Dave invests in stocks, and I is Dave invests in bonds. So Dave invests in both because he's risk averse. He's not risk averse. He can do whatever he wants to. So we'll say the way to combine that then is to say D because Dave invests in stocks, and I because Dave invests in bonds. And it's not the case that either stocks or bonds. So not, and then open parentheses, S or B, close parentheses. It's not the case that either stocks or bonds are a safe investment opportunity. And that shows you there's a second way to illustrate the sentence that we did just before. Neither stocks nor bonds are a safe investment opportunity, a risk-free investment opportunity. Can be represented by the sentence not, open parentheses, S or B, close parentheses. Okay? So sometimes there's more than one way to represent sentences. Let's do another one. Neither stocks or bonds provide an absolutely risk-free investment opportunity, even though both inflation and unemployment remain low. And we're going to say, in this case, U is unemployment remains low, and I will now be inflation remains low. So we're changing the I, okay? Neither stocks or bonds provide an absolute opportunity, even though both inflation and unemployment remain low. So again, we go back and say neither stocks or bonds provide an absolutely free investment opportunity, not, open parentheses, S or B, close parentheses, and you and I, right? Because those are both true. So those are both true, and then it becomes a series of conjunctions. And that is some examples of the homework we're going to be doing this week. Now, one last thing to realize as we go about these. We're working with different operators that are connected with parentheses and brackets. It's important to realize that in every sentence, there is a main operator. There is an operator that is the final deciding point as to whether or not that whole complex sentence is going to be true or false. And sometimes it's the negation at the front of a long bracket. Sometimes it's a conjunction in the middle of two long sentences surrounded in parentheses. But you want to look at the sentence and learn to distinguish what is the main operator in the sentence. And again, you want to follow along in the textbook, look at the textbook examples of main operators, because that will help clarify what that is. But before we go on to some of the more rigorous problem solving, you need to be able to identify what a main operator is. And it's the last one that you would solve for when trying to decide whether or not that sentence is true or false. Again, I know at the beginning, when you first start studying symbolic logic, it is absolutely baffling. It's a foreign language, and it doesn't sound like it makes any sense. And at first, it sounds like it's going to be a little bit like mathematics, and then it turns out to be very different than mathematics. And I know that's confusing. But don't worry, as we work on it together, you will understand how symbolic logic works. It will make sense, and you'll be able to solve some fascinating, fun, difficult, complex problems.